There's no other way. The more I think about it, there's no other way to look at a stochastic outcome in role playing, whether it's dice or cards, or maybe it's one of these weird systems where we each contribute a word and then we pick a word out of the hat, right? Whatever it is, I don't care. As long as it is stochastic, there is a range of possibilities and some randomized way by which we determine, where we fall. And why do we do that? I just ran into this with some, brainless genius at YouTube, commenting about, that's why I play fate-based games, because we want to make a narrative, not play Yahtzee. Right? Instead, that's we have fate points that to help us make the story. We are not ruled by our evil dice. And up here in the Nordic lands, there is a whole raft of theorists who will, spout that line. Dice are a terrible holdover from wargaming, and they just get in the way. And we don't let the system get in the way. You've all heard those phrases, right?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas I, of course, turn around and say this horrendous, evil thing of saying, wait a minute, this is our most valuable device, the capacity to be put on your back foot instead of being in control of what's happening. Being in control of what's happening is writing the story down after you have determined what it is. Either improvising it in the moment or making it up 10 years ago. I don't care which. It's not being written. It's not happening as fiction until we know what it is. You've got it. I'm saying, no, get out of that mode. You don't have it. As you play, you don't have it. So what I mean is, what are we doing with these things? We are finding ways for, in the most basic sense of task resolution, for your character not to do it well, for it not to happen that way. And then there are many other versions of this, things that we pull dice, pull cards for, or roll dice for, anything like that. And we are finding out the way that it goes wrong or differently. Vincent talks about this at his Anyway website. And if you want to see a whole bunch of commenters just suddenly run around in circles trying to reinterpret what he says because they don't get it and they don't like it, was when he said, you need to have things happen in play that you don't want. And everybody just went berserk and he couldn't possibly have said that, and ran around trying to interpret it. And now I know that the language is inexact here, because there's you who wants whatever, who wants it. It's a state of mind that we don't have a good vocabulary for. It's the state of mind of an audience member who weeps in grief that this thing happens to that character. But of course, they love this story that includes this terrible event.
Oh, we have a word for it, Ron. It's called fun.
Well, I agree with that. But you know as well as I do that the Italian language community online will turn that word into an enormous labyrinth of nonsense. So
there's this anti-fun that right. Fun is a bad word. Yeah.
Don't start me on that one. I completely agree. Helma, you're trying to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, two things actually. One thing is the soup you cook, if you put everything in it to make it perfect, is tasteless.
Right.
I mean, if you build the perfect story, the result is going to be tasteless.
Mm-hmm.
It's the worst thing you can do. So that's why I'm watching both Star Trek and The Good Sand Agenda. And that's what I'm struggling with in those two games. Because it's really difficult to get some taste into it if everything is slowly moving around one and the same level all the time.
I tend to agree. I'm really hoping somebody gets vaporized by a phaser sooner or later. Right? And there's nothing they can do about it.
I hated to leave my characters in the dirt when I walk away from a game. I can't look them in the face afterwards. But good had I have fun.
Right. Rod, I'm sorry. What was it that you had?
I think I'm behind the conversation now. I don't. I can't remember what I was going to say or what. I was back with the dice with the legendary lives.
Okay, go ahead.
So
we were talking about the importance of these failures and when they work and when they don't. And that game really showed us times when it was incredibly easy for failures to make incredible sense and be the best thing that could have happened. And then other times when we were all just kind of baffled, Game Master included, like, what the hell?
Well,
right.
Well, I was thinking that really unpacked for me, like, why, to think, why are these numbers on this sheet in the first place, this character sheet, what is that for, and things like that related to success and failure. And I had this, like, when we were talking about all this stuff, I don't think I ever told you this, I sort of developed this game mechanic in search of a game, I guess, that's still knocking around in my head, which was like, okay, imagine you've got this game where every roll is a coin flip, straight coin flip. You go into sword fight, odd you fail, even you win the sword fight. But if you have the sword fighting skill, if you lose, you also wound or maim your opponent.
So no matter what, if you're good at it, you're going to do something. But exactly how it turns out is, never mind that. That's not under your control.
Right, but the point being, yeah, it is about what happens when you fail and what does that mean. In Legendary Lives, it was a big deal that your character was supposed to be, was built to be a spy.
That was the character type right out of the book.
Confident spy. And then you were terrible at anything spying because that's
the dice just screwed me every single time on any spying thing. So I ended up being like, I ended up being Death Chick with arrows.
Yeah. So that just reminded me of that the fun is sometimes, not sometimes, it might as well be the entirety of the time in being challenged, right? And that the entire point of playing, like so there's this scene in Back to the Future 3 where they're in the Old West and the guy says, like, run for fun? Why the hell would you do that? And there's like and that's kind of like what I'm thinking about here is that, like, you're kind of subconsciously or at least purposefully putting yourself in a situation where you might fail, but your objective, you don't want to, right? So you're the expectation of the failure, and then either the failure happening or you not incurring in the failure is what generates the fun. At least in a short, like, in a very tight loop. Then we're not talking about like the purpose.
This is one of those times when I really decided that there wasn't a common word. I was able to go through all sorts of Forgish concepts and decide which ones had spun off into stupidity through discussion or my incompetence or whatever, and which ones needed to then be turned into ordinary language. Okay?
Yeah.
There were 2 or 3 terms that could not be reduced to ordinary language. They had to have a new name. And one of those was bounce.
Bounce.
Because if we call it unpredictability, if we call it challenge, if we call it any number of other things, they pull in other meanings. So it has to have an exotic name that then can be learned, right?
You mentioned there are 5 such words or something like that, or like 4 or something like that. Like, what are
that's exactly what I would say is 4, 5, 6, something like that.
A small amount.
That's a handful. Well, certainly bounce, certainly the IIEE as a unit, right?
Yeah.
The authorities. And the authorities include some subtleties like what is narration versus outcome, things like that.
Yeah.
And another one would actually be, and also the authorities includes the concept of situation.
Yep.
I think that splitting out what we call setting into backdrop, situation, scene, is a really good idea, like I did in Circle of Hands. And I think so maybe that's as far as I would go almost.
What about agency? Or do you feel that
agency I keep using with a very small a?
Yeah,
I prefer to let that take on its specific meaning in the moment relative to everything else. Just like you were saying for those techniques like hard framing, right? You take the technique of hard framing. Well, what is that? Well, we don't know what it is unless we're looking at everything else that we're doing. It's the same thing with agency. You could say, look, spending that hero point, that's agency. Well, in this game it is. Right? In that game, it's crap.
English is a very, very expressive language when it comes to availability of vocabulary.
And English is a floozy, Claudio.
Yes, but
that's very polite way to say.
It has a lot of words, and when you translate those words in a more conservative language like Italian, they don't have the same. Like if it's agency in Italian is only used like agentività in the context of the social sciences, no one knows what it means and it requires definition.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have like a common language meaning for it. And a couple of your commonly used expressions sometimes.
This ran into a lot of trouble in the Nordic countries when I wrote about creative agenda, which if Rod will recall, perhaps Sean as well, saying that was good because it got us away from the original language from other authors, from the threefold system. To say creative agenda got us away from that, which was good. But to translate that language into the Nordic languages, now agenda is a Latin word and can be found in precisely the same form here because of that, the same vocabulary. But here it specifically means the schedule of topics to be addressed in order for today's meeting. That's
same in
the
Italian
agenda. And so, of course, that is completely different from any meaning that I used it for, which was, in English, the agenda is the purpose that you act upon without necessarily knowing what it is, without necessarily intending to, except that you obviously do, and also often will be contradicted by your own words, either on purpose or by accident. You will insist that you are here to do this thing. You will swear before God and everybody that you are here to do this thing. But when we see you do what you do, we know what your agenda is. Right? It doesn't have to be a bad thing. Sometimes it's used as a bad thing. You're calling a person a hypocrite. But it can also just be a fact of life that people have these. So that meaning in English is what I was aiming at. But I discovered when I started talking to Nordics, they all thought that I meant something that you practically scheduled before play with everybody so they knew exactly what to do. Right? So I agree that these matter, but that's why dialogue, unfortunately in English, for which I apologize.
It's fine.
But that's why, as Helma is saying, we have to have these careful back and forth dialogues. I mean, how many times have I met people who say, "Oh, you're that story guy." Yeah, I ignore the system for the sake of the story all the time, too. I get that all the time. Right. Greg, what were you going to say?
No, nothing. We have the same problem in French. I was struggling with the same, with the word idiom. Well, it's not really related.
Right.
Idiom in French is basically dialects. That's why I couldn't understand what you meant by
right,
idiom.
Yeah. In other words, it was a specifically linguistic term in French.
Yeah, I had to check in the Oxford dictionary to understand it was not the same meaning.
Oh, the English dictionaries, every entry has 7 meanings, right? Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these words have their original meanings in English, but also sprout all of these metaphorical and local uses